America in this young century proclaims liberty throughout all the world and to all the inhabitants thereof. Renewed in our strength, tested but not weary, we are ready for the greatest achievements in the history of freedom. May God bless you, and may He watch over the United States of America.
So I love a lot of things about the United States of America. But when I hear the presidents of the United States end their speeches with, "God bless the United States of America," all I can think of, and I've been like this all my life, all I can think of is that patriotism, that kind of love of country ends up being a license for war, for imperialism, for murder, for the domination of the world. You know, in spite of the Irish people's kind of devotion to Irish neutrality, and we know that neutrality is a very popular position in Ireland, Ireland has a remarkably compliant relationship with the United States government, a real consistent willingness to do whatever it takes to earn the approval of United States governments of whatever stripe. There's no question that Ireland, in spite of not being a member of any military coalition, was one of the coalition of the willing, as George W. Bush famously called those countries that were standing with the United States in its wars in Afghanistan and Iraq.
The United States of America has been enormously good friends of this country, and we feel appropriate. Well, no. We have to support the United States of America in this case. We're not withdrawing. We're not withdrawing. My nephew is out in the front.
Are lying about our Constitution, Mr. Layton.
There's 40 million Irish Americans, so I think that their approach to this.
I've seen you in the markets, I've seen you in the streets, and at your political conventions. Talking of your crusade, talking of your nation, and other things too terrible to mention. And you proclaim your Christianity, you proclaim your love of God, you talk of apple pie and mom. I've just got one question, and I want an answer. Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Maybe Jesus would bomb the Syrians, 'cause they're not Jews like him. Maybe Jesus would bomb the Afghans on some kind of vengeful whim. Maybe Jesus would drive an M1 tank and he would shoot Saddam. Who would Jesus bomb?
Of course, in early 2003, it looked inevitable that war was coming in Iraq, as it had been in Afghanistan for more than a year.
The security of the world requires disarming Saddam Hussein now.
Shannon Airport in the west of Ireland had become a focus for the anti-war movement from the very beginning of the war in Afghanistan, really, and then that built up over the period leading up to the war in Iraq. This took a couple of forms, some of which involved peace encampments and peace demonstrations taking place at the airport, and some of which involved a more kind of systematic watching of the airport in terms of American military equipment, in terms of troop numbers, and looking at the role that Shannon was playing in the build-up to the wars.
Well, that's American Transit or TriStar.
Full of US troops.
What is it that 30 of her Shannon agreed to when he met George Bush. What agreement did he make? There is no connection between preparing for a war, a strike against Iraq, and any international campaign against terrorism. It is not a choice between Saddam and anything else. It is a choice for morality. It is a choice of peace against war, of putting diplomacy in place.
So there were a number of aspects to what was coming through Shannon from an American military and intelligence perspective. Some of it had to do with the war in Afghanistan. Some of it had to do with the impending war in Iraq, and that was very large movements of troops for the most part. There was clearly equipment as well, but the troop numbers were in the tens of thousands per month in early 2003. And then there was an additional aspect which was more to do with this amorphous war on terror that the United States was operating throughout the world, not just in Afghanistan and Iraq. And that involved the capturing of suspected al-Qaeda operatives and then moving them to various other countries, often to hidden black sites that were operated by client governments where interrogation and torture could take place. And so it was the role of Shannon as part of an international network operated largely by the CIA of so-called extraordinary rendition, the bringing of these suspects from one place in the world to another in order that they could be tortured in many cases. And we know now that there were indeed many cases of torture, that the role of Shannon in that torture network became part of the concern of the anti-war movement in this period and for many years afterwards.
It's unknown to most of the people using the airport that it's been used by the military. They're unaware of the danger that they're being presented in because US military use of this airport makes this airport a terrorist target. And this airport does not have the facilities, the security for that type of threat.
The wars that are being propagated at the moment by the US, that even in the name of all US citizens, are likely to be totally counterproductive. We need peace now. We need to actively work for peace. It's very easy to start a war. It's much more difficult to start a peace movement. So,
and I just want to say that this could be the last opportunity that we have to protest here. I appeal particularly to the Garda force that are here to think seriously about what you're protecting.
Five people have been arrested at Shannon Airport following an incident in which a US Navy aircraft was damaged. The five arrested are 30-year-old Karen Fallon, 31-year-old Nuwan Dunlop, along with Damien Moran, aged 22, Kieran O'Reilly, 42, and 32-year-old Deirdre Clancy.
My name is Deirdre Clancy. I was involved in the Iraq War resistance with a group of 4 other people. We were coming at it from a faith-based perspective. There's a piece of scripture in Isaiah which is kind of supposed to be a prophecy, if you like.
They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. It's a vision of the weapons of war turned into instruments of peace and plenty. And that vision has always been part of any utopian understanding of how it is that we replace war and militarism with peace and justice. So when the pit stop plowshares come to act at Shannon Airport, they see Shannon correctly as a stop in the American war machine, as a place where literally, as in a race where cars go into a pit stop to refuel on their way around the track, where the American war machine was going to refuel on its way to the Middle East. So Shannon Airport was correctly identified as a pit stop of death.
This airport has lost any status as a civilian institution. The railway lines that led to the town of Auschwitz were built for civilian use like this airport was. But they were demonised and changed and became a pit stop on the assembly of death, and that is what Shannon Airport is today.
I make a huge distinction in my own mind between my personal faith and the institutional church. So my own personal faith is how I view the person of Christ, what I feel Christ represents. And for the most part, that tallies with, what a lot of Christian churches would say. But there are ways in which I feel it doesn't always, for instance, the way women have been mistreated in Ireland, the view towards gay people as well would be another aspect of it. I was very engaged from my teenage years with the counterculture of the United States. So from the age of about 13, I was listening to Bob Dylan and his early songs, which were very anti-war. I was very aware as well of the Cold War, which was still happening when I was growing up. And I remember even as a young child, I had cousins who I used to play with who were my age. And we used to discuss, what would we do if World War III happened, if there was a nuclear holocaust? Would we want to survive, or would we run towards the bomb in order to just be destroyed? So I was acutely aware that the technology was there to destroy the world as we knew it. It was a shock when it happened, incredibly shocking, horrific atrocity. But there was a lot, the immediate reaction I could see in a lot of people was, we're going to bomb these bastards into the Stone Age.
I can hear you! I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
There was kind of also a religious theme to George W. Bush's declarations of war, and he had used the term crusade at one point, which was very emotive and had a catastrophic effect, I'd say, on the Muslim world as well. Insensitive doesn't even begin to describe it. Invading Iraq was not the immediate concern. It was more Afghanistan, because that was thought to be where bin Laden was hiding. But, it was obvious at the time also that this would be used as sort of a launching pad to getting rid of Saddam Hussein.
The danger is clear. Using chemical, biological, or one-day nuclear weapons obtained with the help of Iraq, the terrorists could fulfill their stated ambitions and kill thousands or hundreds of thousands of innocent people in our country or any other.
Nobody in the anti-war movement, barring a few cranks, really supported him. It wasn't about him. It's that if you bomb Iraq, you're not just trying to get Saddam Hussein and his henchmen. There's a whole country there that's already still ravaged by the 1991 Gulf War and very, very badly affected by the UN sanctions that had been in place for 10 years. So this was a country that was already, in a sense, on its knees. And they were going to, you know, bomb it into the Stone Age again.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
We had spent some time in Glenstall Abbey for a few nights before we acted, so I think that really strengthened our resolve. I mean, most people were wavering at some point in the process, at different points for each person, but for me, certainly, I would have said the time spent sort of contemplating it would have strengthened my resolve. I think it is important before you do an action like that to examine your own kind of readiness and motivations. I think the only time I remember hesitating was when the fence was cut through and I was going, okay, once I go through this fence, that's it, you know, I've actually committed myself to doing this action. So I knew it could be quite a serious action resulting in serious charges. So I did have a moment of fear there. We noticed that there was a car that came around once every 2 or 3 minutes, and we'd all ducked down. There were 2 kind of windows beside the door of the hangar, and we just broke those, you know, the classic kind of thing you see in films where you just put your hand in and open from the inside. It was actually that easy. And then when we got in, there's this plane in front of you. I just remember feeling very surreal, you know, you're standing there and you're kind of there, we actually managed to get to it, you know. There was this moment of, wow, I can't believe we actually managed this. There was a guard guarding the plane, but he was kind of dozing off, and I was quite concerned for him because I knew that our presence there would probably cause him a lot of upset, you know, so I did sort of feel the need to knock on the door of the squad car just to let the guy know that we were there. The 2 other women were building this shrine, and the shrine consisted of pictures of people affected by war, particularly children, a copy of the Bible, a copy of the Quran, rosary beads, Muslim prayer beads to kind of symbolize reconciliation, if you like. Everybody had different implements with them. I had a hammer, so I decided to go somewhere in the middle and work on the side panels. Damien, being the trainee priest at the time, though he didn't go on to become a priest, started doing a sort of an edited down version of the rosary. So that's what we were doing basically when the guards came.
The Pit Stop Plowshares are part of a historic movement known as the Plowshares movement that goes back as plowshares that goes back to 1980, but really has its roots in aspects of the anti-Vietnam War movement in the United States. The Catholic worker movement had developed as a kind of a movement bringing aid and comfort to the poor, but in the 1960s, several of its members, and particularly two very prominent priests, Philip and Daniel Berrigan, were part of a series of public actions, and particularly a very notorious one in Catonsville, Maryland in 1968, in which draft records were removed from a draft office, brought out into a public space, and burned with a homemade napalm equivalent, essentially on behalf of young Americans to protect them from the prospect of going to fight in this dreadful war in Vietnam, but also on behalf of the Vietnamese people, burning paper instead of burning children, as Father Dan Berrigan famously said. I've been involved in anti-war and anti-imperialist and social justice politics, I guess, more or less all my life. My father was a great admirer of Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement. He had been a Catholic priest himself, active in the anti-war movement, in the civil rights movement, and in the movement for housing justice. Philip Berrigan was actually arrested in my father's closet eventually after Catonsville in 1970. Actually, my father sort of eventually leaves the priesthood and comes to live with his children, largely because of the fallout from Catonsville, because the FBI is investigating him over his involvement with the anti-war movement and says, look at this guy has a family in New Jersey as well, so maybe we should do something about that. So Catonsville has this combination of a kind of a moral force, a intellectual force, a political impact, and a personal sort of dimension for my life and the life of my family that makes it among the most profound set of images that I could ever look at.
We make our prayer in the name of that God whose name is peace and decency and unity and love. Amen.
So Catonsville is often seen as the kind of point of origin of this direct action tradition. But what happens in the 1980s is that instead of it being aimed at a particular war or at the, if you like, the bureaucratic apparatus of that war, as was the case in Catonsville, from 1980 onwards, the Plowshares movement is aimed at the instruments of war themselves, with a very particular critique of nuclear weapons in particular as being the most inhumane, world-destructing, God-killing piece of machinery.
The reaction varied quite a lot in the anti-war movement to our action. I would say it ranged from people who saw us as violent and, as discrediting the anti-war movement, to people who supported us immediately. Then there would be aspects of the anti-war left then that would be against anything with the word Catholic in it, no matter what, what the background was.
There was this combination of admiration and aversion throughout the anti-war movement. And when that major demonstration did come in Dublin on February 15th, the Pit Stop Plowshares were not discussed from the podium. Nobody said, we stand in solidarity with the Pit Stop Plowshares.
The church weren't doing a huge amount about the Iraq War that I could see. I mean, I think, yes, the church was officially against it. But as regards our action, I don't think it would have been seen as representative of the institutional church at all, or of the Irish, particularly not of the Irish hierarchy. You know, I mean, you could say it's not really the place of the Catholic hierarchy to, you know, to support people who do actions like ours. It's not what they normally do. But they didn't, you know, they didn't really support the Berrigan brothers either. In the first year, or even 2 years after we did the action, I don't think we would have expected even a hung jury. I mean, we were seen in many ways as just, you know, the cranky side of the anti-war movement. We were blamed for all sorts of things that weren't the case. You know, we were going to collapse the economy of the entire west of Ireland. No American tourists would ever come to Ireland again. There were all sorts of things were said about us. By the time we got to the third trial, the climate had changed an awful lot, because people had made discoveries about the war. It had come out that, you know, actually there were no weapons of mass destruction found in Iraq. Various whistleblowers had come out. So the climate was quite different by the time we got to the third trial.
The Pit Stop Ploughshares is an action against the instruments of war, but also against Irish participation and the enacting of a particular attack on the people of Iraq. And when the Pit Stop Ploughshares come to justify their actions, they do it very much in terms of protecting the lives of Iraqi people in the spring of 2003.
There were jubilant scenes outside the forecourts following the acquittal of 5 people accused of causing criminal damage to a US Navy plane at Shannon Airport. The 5 argued that they had lawful excuse to do so because they were trying to save property and lives in Iraq.
You know, that moment just still sends shivers down my spine when I think about it. I'm really thankful to the jury for giving us a chance, for believing in our testimony and in our motivations. I also tear up a little bit because the day we were acquitted was my sister-in-law's birthday, and my sister-in-law had died in a tragic accident just, you know, about 6 months before the third trial took place, and that loss was still very, you know, very alive in my mind at that time. And and somehow, you know, I attributed it to her looking out for me in a weird sort of a way, you know. So, thank you, Nora. And St. Francis of Assisi, who I prayed to St. Francis in a church across the road from the forecourts just as the jury were still out, so I kind of attribute it to him as well. I'm still get very emotional thinking about that day.
The decision of this jury should be a message to London, Washington, D.C. and the Dáil that Ireland wants no part in waging war on the people of Iraq. Refueling of US warplanes at Shannon Airport should cease immediately.
It's something that's really precious and it shouldn't be gotten rid of. They're making moves to get rid of the Irish neutrality. The Irish people are saying no. what we did was right, and what other people feel need to do will be right too.
Every life, without exception, has something sacred in it. That means every life of every person in Iraq is as sacred as every life of every person in the United States and in Ireland.
As Deirdre just said, the conscience of the Irish community has spoken, and we call on the Irish government to seize this illegal activity, because what our act was 3.5 years ago was legal.
I think that the message that that sent about being able to, if you like, persuade a dozen ordinary people that this action was not only morally justifiable, but legally justifiable, I think that was really, that was important and had a lasting impact. And the fact that actions, faith-based and otherwise, against the weapons of war at Shannon Airport, and indeed weapons of war elsewhere here in Ireland, continued after the pit stop plowshares, and I think especially after their acquittal, I think is an important part of their legacy.
So we're here in Limerick. It's around 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and we're just in the final stage of preparation for doing an action in Shannon Airport, myself and Colm. So I think what both of us have in common around this action is it's a faith-based action, which means that the reason we're here is because of our faith. And it's because of the value, I think, that we place on human life, and the fact that the US military continue to use Shannon Airport, a military that has been responsible for the deaths of so many innocent men, women and children. It demands a faith response, and that's why we're here.
If you've not got the relevant identification to be airside here at the airport, you've not got the relevant identification to be here at the airport.
Colm Roddy is my name. I'm 79 years of age. I was brought up in a very comfortable family background. I was a Catholic, and I was more or less conditioned not to question anything. I was told in those times that was the way. We accepted more or less everything that came from the Pope down in the church. I remember my poor mother, God rest her, at the age of 17 or 18, she sent me down to the Franciscans to ask the confessor in confession to tell me the facts of life. That's the kind of Ireland it was there. Even my mother didn't have she didn't feel confident about teaching me about what procreation, you know, how life is formed. And I was sent to the local Franciscan to learn that, and he hadn't a clue either. During my life, I've kind of moved from seeing myself as a Catholic to seeing myself as a Christian. And the Bible really, and the New Testament in particular, are my kind of point of reference. And I saw this war. I saw the people in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Syria as my neighbours, my planetary neighbours. And in the Bible, Jesus said that the primary commandment was to love your God and love your neighbour as yourself. And I saw it as my duty in loving my neighbour to oppose those who were inflicting violence on them and who were quite ruthless, who were quite uncaring about what so-called collateral damage they did. Collateral damage was in fact the killing of innocent people.
You're clear. All right, firing. Line here. Let's stay line now. Let me know when you get it. We'll shoot. Light them all up. 2 traffic, 260. Come on, fire. Yeah, right. Keep shooting. Keep shooting.
Colm Ruddy is an extraordinary activist. He's someone that anyone who's been around the anti-war movement has known Colm as an absolute fixture of anti-war activity here in Ireland. For a long time, Colm's particular focus on the question of extraordinary rendition was played out through his wearing of the kind of orange Guantanamo jumpsuit. And he would appear at actions restrained in some way, you know, chained or handcuffed in the orange suit. And he was, in that moment, the living embodiment of what was being carried out with Ireland's complicity and through the actions of the United States throughout the world, and what might be happening at Shannon Airport. And so I was not at all surprised when Colm joined with Dave, who I also knew for a long time and had been very close to the Pit Stop Plowshares, when Colm and Dave combined to insist that it was time for the inspections at Shannon Airport to happen in a serious way, and if the state wasn't going to carry them out, that civilians should do so.
Like, I had been engaged in peaceful protest at government buildings and at Shannon. I used to go down every month to a vigil against US military use of Shannon. And I had realised more and more this was not really very effective, like the authorities could live with it. So I was trying to build up my inner strength and my courage to actually do something, to actually oppose the US military use of Shannon, but it took me 15 years to do that. The opportunity came when some people down there suggested that a way of doing it might be to go in through the fence and to kind of try and go up to the planes that were there at the time and to challenge the people protecting them to actually, rather than protect them, to actually search to see if there was killer equipment on board of those planes. Anyway, we got the message one night, late at night. I was about to go to bed at the time when the message came through that there were two US military aircraft in Shannon Airport. So I rang Dave. My wife gave me a lift over to his place and we drove down to Shannon about midnight, arriving about 2 or 3 in the morning. And about 5 in the morning we set out for the airport. And ideally we would have liked to have gone over the fence without doing damage. But I have brittle bones, and it was obvious that if we had tried to go over the fence we might have fallen off and broken a leg, and that would be that. A guy who was going to do video for us, he videoed the whole thing from outside the fence, but also Dave had glasses with a little recording camera. I didn't realise, but he was recording me cutting the fence as well, and this ended up as evidence against me. But we cut the hole, and the tension was off us once we got in because we'd been very uptight. I was very nervous. I carried an Irish flag as my commemoration of the people who died in 1916. The people in 1916 were colonised by the great military empire of the time, the British Empire. And here, 100 years later, I saw Shannon Airport as a portion of my country which was colonised by the current day military superpower. Dave painted a number of red crosses on that, and at each red cross we stopped and said a prayer for the American military people who'd gone through Shannon and came back in body bags, and also for their victims in those countries. We crossed the main runway, and we were only about 50 yards in from the runway when this mighty plane took off. That plane that took off turned out to be an extremely sinister plane, an American military plane which had been in the airport. We continued on along a taxiway, and after about 40 minutes walk, we saw this Learjet, an Irish Army vehicle on one side and a Garda car on the other side. So we headed straight for that plane with the object of possibly searching it if we could get into it. And we were within about less than 100 yards of the plane when one of the Army personnel must have spotted us. Will you search that plane?
Not come any closer, you have been warned.
Yeah, please search that plane.
We believe there's war crimes being committed by that plane. We're asking you to search it. In the name of Jesus Christ, we demand that you search the plane.
To search that plane, we believe there's national and international law being broken. We're asking you to search that plane.
See some identification, please. Can we see some identification, please?
Could you search the plane, please?
Have you got the relevant identification to be here?
We believe there's a war crime being committed.
Identification to be
We're
here.
officially asking you.
Have you got a relevant identification to be here?
I'm here in the name of God.
Have you got the relevant...
What was it like being arrested? Well, I had reached 74 years of age. I had never been perceived to break the law, and I had never been arrested. Despite a number of times that when I was protesting, I was asked to move from places and stuff. It was quite a bit of an anticlimax, really. There is a lawful excuse defence in the Criminal Damage Act, but it's conditional and it's at the discretion of the judge. Given the average, 95% of judges wouldn't have allowed us to use the lawful excuse defence. So my plan A was to go the legal route by giving evidence to give the context of our action, which was missing in the charge. That was my plan A, and plan B, which I expected to have to fall back on, was based entirely on my duties as a Christian. As it happened, when Dave and I came to court, we were extraordinarily blessed that we got a judge who was extraordinary. She was exceptional, Judge Karen O'Connor. And she never doubted our entitlement to lawful excuse. So we had the benefits of a summing up speech, and I got very emotional about being made complicit in the murder of innocents. I got actually overwhelmed by emotion during the closing up speech. Kind of coming back now again, but that went down very powerfully with the jury. And I felt we have done our bit. We were quite relaxed. I never had the least worry. I was convinced we were going to be acquitted because we had punched a major hole in the state case. We had stated the context of our action through our cross-examination, and we had shown how deeply we felt about it. I even get emotional.
Two peace activists on trial for alleged criminal damage at Shannon Airport were today acquitted of all charges. Judge Karen O'Connor had told the jury that the offence of criminal damage does allow for a defence where the accused acted in order to protect himself or another.
On my account, you will be brought before governors and kings as witnesses to them and to the Gentiles. But when they arrest you, do not worry about what to say or how to say it. At that time, you will be given what to say, For it will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. That's Matthew chapter 10.
Because of your service, because of your sacrifice, we are defeating them there where they live, so we do not have to face them where we live. Because of you, the people of Iraq no longer live in fear of being executed and left in mass graves.
I mean, the legacy is ISIS, it's various attacks on civilians in France, in the UK, and in other parts of Europe, and massive casualties in Syria. I don't even know if I'm qualified to talk about the legacy, because the legacy is, it's still in formation, if you like, and a lot of it is suffering. Is Iraq liberated now? Well, it is from, I suppose, from a dictator. But it's not free of violence by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, not even close, so.
On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign. More than 35 countries are giving crucial support, from the use of naval and air bases, to help with intelligence and logistics, to the deployment of combat units. Every nation in this coalition has chosen to bear the duty and share the honor of serving in our common defense.
I was happy to grow up in a country which had a peace-loving kind of a stance, certainly back in the 1960s and 1970s. But then, as time moved on, my country began to see itself as a close ally of the United States of America. And they took on board the value system of the empires rather than the value systems of the colonized. And they developed the same blindness or denial about the reality that was being facilitated at Shannon. So I felt I had to protest in whatever way I could against the complicity of my country in the killing.
In American politics, the elections of both Barack Obama and Donald Trump, opposites though they may have been in many ways, those elections stood in many respects on their anti-war credentials. The American people clearly had not ever really been fully persuaded by those wars. And it's interesting, I grew up in the 1970s and 80s in the United States when the establishment fretted about the Vietnam syndrome, that the legacy of Vietnam would be that the American people weren't comfortable with foreign wars. I think we're looking at something similar to that again, that the American people are and remain uncomfortable with foreign wars, and they'll elect a Democrat or a Republican who they think has got some kind of aversion to those wars. Joe Biden, we know, was one of the people in the Obama White House who was even opposed to doubling down on the war in Afghanistan and eventually did withdraw American troops from Afghanistan. Obviously, part of that legacy in the 21st century is the capacity and the desire to carry out wars that are remote, that don't require a lot of troops on the ground, that are carried out with drones. Maybe the next Pit Stop Plowshares action needs to be against a drone facility rather than against an airplane that carries troops and equipment to a distant war in the Middle East.
A lot of people would point at the Plowshares movement and say, this is a misuse of scripture. But we're using it as a way of symbolizing the hope for a better future, a future where the type of warfare that destroys entire communities and families and indiscriminately kills and dismembers is no longer necessary, no longer deemed necessary, where the material resources that are put into maintaining a world where war is a constant is put into other resources, more holistic resources, things like education, healthcare. It's what it symbolizes. It's not that people who do Plowshares actions are saying, well, we're prophets. But I think every Plowshares action that happens is an act of hope.
In the markets, I've seen you in the streets and at your political conventions, talking of your crusade, talking of your nation and other things too terrible to mention. And you proclaim your Christianity, you proclaim your love of God, you talk of apple pie and mine. I've just got one question and I want an answer. Tell me, who would Jesus bomb?